I think where things are like really interesting, but maybe not thought about enough is how do we address this sort of data or IP question? Because this is not just a crypto native observation, but Ilyas Iskever, who is the co-founder of OpenAI, is now working on like his own thing. He at NeurIPS, he said basically that data is going to be the fossil fuel of AI. And what that means is that we've trained on like most of the open web. But synthetic data, artificially generated data doesn't really improve performance. So you have this conundrum where if you want to continue scaling, you kind of need to find a way to access differentiated IP. And I think that's where a lot of value capture is going to be, but it's also where there's no like real business model, right? Like if you look at OpenAI, they're suing the New York Times on the one hand and also paying Fox $10 million a year, right? So the New York Times and Fox are, they're both kind of IP providers, but there's no single one size fits all approach. And I think that what blockchains do is ultimately create unstoppable markets for things. And I think creating unstoppable markets for AI training data is going to be really interesting.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Mind with CoinFund. Our podcast dives deep into the untold narratives of the crypto space. I'm Jake, founder and CEO of CoinFund. Today, I'm joined by CoinFund partner, Evan Feng. Hey, Evan, what's going on?
Hey, Jake. Hey, everybody. Great to be here. As we're recording this, it's the beginning of crypto conference season. So we're heading down to WAGME this week in Miami, have ETH Denver next month. And after that, the conferences won't stop coming. So Jake, how should founders approach connecting with investors and other community members on the ground at these events?
Everyone has their own way, I guess, but I'll tell you how I like to do it. I like building relationships with founders. I kind of hate being pitched in real time, especially in an elevator, because I'm a visual learner. I need to see a deck to really get the project. But what I'm often looking for are people who are doing interesting things and kind of thinking about the current events of the space in an interesting way. So I'm looking around for people who are like less selling and more being present and active in the community. What about you, Evan? What are some of your tips for founders?
Yeah, I think one of my tips is to just take advantage of the opportunity to meet not only people that might have a direct business relationship with you, meaning potential investors, but also spend time trying to build the community by really just getting to know everybody that you have time to. Ultimately, these conferences are forcing functions that really identify and self-select for people that are really interested in the future of crypto through a variety of different applications of the technology. So often a great time to meet folks that might use your product or even just evangelize. $0 CAC is something we love founders to try to identify. And it's a very fertile ground with respect to looking for opportunities to onboard people in that way. So yeah, with that preamble, let's get right into today's episode, which is really diving a bit deeper into the trend that we're seeing in the markets, which is how AI is really continuing to dominate the Web3 space. At CoinFund, we've actually been investing closely at this intersection for several years now, and there continues to be a great deal of innovation that's important to unpack and explore, especially within the sub-narrative intersection of media and AI. So we've actually brought on two founders today who are experts in this area to chat about it with us. Please welcome Doug Petkanics, founder and CEO of Livepeer, a decentralized AI video creation platform and one of CoinFund's portfolio companies. And we also have today as another guest, Jason Zhao, co-founder of Story Protocol, a decentralized network at the intersection of AI and IP leveraging blockchain. So Doug and Jason, welcome to the show. How's it going, guys?
Great. Yeah. Thanks for having us. Thanks for hosting. Excited to be here and talk about AI meets crypto meets media.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really excited to chat here. One of the most exciting intersections. I don't know what you guys have planned, but I'm sure it'll go off the rails and it'll be really interesting exploration.
Not too far off the rails, I hope. But why don't we dive into the thing that we always ask folks that we ask on the podcast, true to the name, which is what is the one thing, guys, in crypto that you're seeing, but no one is really talking about, but they should be paying attention to it? Give us some alpha here in terms of your view on the space.
Yeah, sure. I'm happy to start. So I think since this topic is about the intersection of artificial intelligence and blockchains, I'll just talk about something in that space. So the way I generally see AI playing out is that there's basically three major pillars in the AI arms race. The first is models, the second is compute, and the last is IP or data. And I think that a lot of people, there's a lot of innovation in all three, but within the crypto space, I think most of the focus has been on the first two pillars. So on the model side and on the compute side, right? So I think that those are very interesting efforts. And by models, I think that you can even fit AI agents into that because mostly agents are sort of like wrappers around a core LLM model with like, an API integration as well as a vector database. And so I think, when you look at models and compute, these first two pillars, I think that like in the traditional AI arms race, there's going to be a lot of commoditization in the stack in terms of value capture. So in the model side, like we've been using the same transformer model architecture that was invented at Google in 2016 up until this day. And a lot of these architectures are becoming open source, right? So you're seeing not just Llama, but also DeepSeek, which is a state-of-the-art open source model trained for $10 million. So I think there's going to actually be a lot of commoditization at the model layer. And then on the compute side, I think that you're going to see similar things where, of course, compute is a sort of like rate limiting factor right now, but the US, China, Saudi Arabia, other players in the Middle East are really making massive pushes to build out data centers and bring a ton of energy to compute. So I think ultimately, like a lot of the compute is going to be commodified as well. And I think where things are like really interesting, but maybe not thought about enough, is how do we address this sort of data or IP question? Because this is not just a crypto native observation, but Ilyas Iskever, who is the co-founder of OpenAI, is now working on like his own thing. He at NeurIPS, he said basically that data is going to be the fossil fuel of AI. And what that means is that we've trained on like most of the open web. But synthetic data, artificially generated data, doesn't really improve performance. So you have this conundrum where if you want to continue scaling, you kind of need to find a way to access differentiated IP. And I think that's where a lot of value capture is going to be, but it's also where there's no like real business model, right? Like if you look at OpenAI, they're suing the New York Times on the one hand and also paying Fox $10 million a year, right? So the New York Times and Fox are, they're both kind of IP providers, but there's no single one size fits all approach. And I think that what blockchains do is ultimately create unstoppable markets for things. And I think creating unstoppable markets for AI training data is going to be really interesting. Obviously, Story, like we have a sort of opinionated approach about how we want to do that. But ultimately, like the conversation, I think, has been really about models and compute. But I think the unanswered question, the real like Napster moment, so to speak, is in this IP and data pillar. So that's kind of where we're spending a lot of time thinking. And I think that's where blockchains are uniquely suited to provide a lot of value.
Thanks, Jason. What about you, Doug? What should everyone be paying attention to?
Probably unsurprising to you guys. I'm going to take it back old school a little bit. I think people are not paying as much attention to the fundamental promises of what these technologies represent and can enable. And, because we're not really talking about money so much today or digital finance and money, we're talking more about AI and infrastructure services like compute and storage and bandwidth and whatnot. I think one of the fundamental promises that people aren't talking a lot about is how crypto can be used to enable infrastructure services that are actually, maximally cost effective, seemingly infinitely scalable, and maximally reliable as a result of the cost effective redundancies. And that's actually a superpower of what crypto economics can enable. They can incentivize open marketplaces to coordinate where people are competing to offer infrastructure services on price. That drives price down. The speculation that people might have around the value of tokens that are being issued can offset prices people need to charge. So once again, you can end up with these nearly free to use, infinitely, maximally cost effective infrastructure services. And that matters so much in the world of AI when it's so expensive to access these GPUs, whether it's for training or inference. So, cost savings by order of magnitude through crypto networks could be one of the breakthrough aha moments as the technology all comes together to enable this for these use cases. And as a result, you can get these, sort of highly scalable systems due to the abundance of compute out there that can be coordinated, and then high reliability as well through redundancies. So, been saying this for years, and we've proved it and seen it play out on the, video transcoding and infrastructure side at Livepeer. We look forward to applying it to the AI compute side as well, and really looking forward for the impact to be felt and the markets take note of this.
I agree, Doug, especially when you think about like the fact that in AI, to get to the level of intelligence that, we're getting to, we really need to stretch our capabilities on almost every dimension. We need to stretch and get the biggest data center for compute. We need to get the biggest data set. We need to stretch the framework of how the model is being computed, by making it computable on GPUs versus like something else, right? And so, yeah, I agree with you. Those costs are gonna, or that cost efficiency is going to enable us to stretch even a little bit further to get even a better result.
I was going to switch gears a little, and we've talked about supply, and Doug, as you mentioned, some of the progress at Livepeer, and certainly there are other decentralized compute networks out there as well. So I think supply is one that's maybe a dynamic better understood versus something like demand. So maybe turning that back over to Jason, and how do you at Story think about the sources of demand ultimately with respect to the infrastructure, but also just from a blockchain and block space demand perspective? You guys, I think, recently launched developer mainnet. So congratulations on that. But, kind of building in and they will come is something that crypto has always been pretty good at, but predicting that or timing that correctly, how do you think about calibrating the build of the network from a product perspective to match where demand will spring up?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I think for blockchains, there's kind of two ways of sourcing demand. The first is better explored, and the second is maybe less explored. The first is basically peer-to-peer, very individual transactions. That's where blockchains thrive. That's where I think, Solana, Base, other payment networks that really focus on these sort of peer-to-peer transactions, especially sort of in developing nations, right? So I think that's one angle. Another angle, just using payments as an analogy, is probably more like Ripple, right? Where they're going to these banks and they're trying to actually engage in these large volume transactions, trying to replace Swift. And so I think when it comes to what Story's built, like our mainnet is live as of a couple of days ago, I think what we've already built out is like an ecosystem of a lot of peer-to-peer IP transactions. So we have probably 50 to 75 ecosystem apps. Some of them are fully Web 2 with like 2.5 million individual users per app. So it's not like a trivial amount of volume, but mostly what people are doing is taking individual IP assets as individual creators and IP holders, and they're trying to license them to make a comic or to make a t-shirt, or maybe they want to like take an IP asset and plug it into a lending protocol so they can use IPS collateral. These are kind of like peer-to-peer use cases where I think blockchains have thrived, and a lot of ecosystem focus has been driven around creating an ecosystem of demand in these like, smaller individual instances. Why Story's so focused on IP is because I'm thinking kind of systematically about the demand side, because again, I agree. Like if there is demand, supply will come. Blockchains are really well suited at bootstrapping supply. So the question that I'm asking, and this is sort of informed by my experience at DeepMind, is what is going to be the biggest source of demand for IP in the next decade and in the next century? And I think it's going to increasingly evolve to AI companies. So foundation model companies that want to fine tune AI models, I think they will be the biggest sources of demand for IP. And so that's why we've really pushed hard to work with these AI companies, including Stability AI, which is kind of the first announcement there. And the thesis is kind of twofold. Number one is that these AI companies on the trading side, like as I mentioned before, a lot of the open internet is already commoditized, right? So you want an edge. Well, data is one of the core factors that gives you an edge. So having access to differentiated IP that's cleanly licensed is one of the factors that can turn a good AI model into a great one, and a great AI model into an amazing one. And so I think with these foundation model companies, being able to seamlessly license essentially the world's largest data set with a single API call without having to worry about, many, many lawsuits or having to do a million individual licensing deals, that's really appealing to them. And then the other side is actually on the output side, which is we believe that, 90 to 99% of the content in the future is going to be AI generated. And if that's the case, from a bootstrapping perspective on our ecosystem, it's actually much more effective to work with model companies so that everything that the AI models output, in this case, everything that Stable Diffusion outputs, is actually by default registered on Story, where it's this sort of source of truth for these AI models to register their outputs and keep track of them. So that kind of like how we think about it. And then lastly, I think with the recent inauguration and the change of hands in the American administration, I think that this is kind of the institutional cycle. And a lot of what I'm focused on in 2025 is actually hopefully working with the US Copyright Office, Patent Office, Trademark Office, as well as other governments to really embed Story into their IP systems. And I think that will actually kind of bootstrap on the demand that's already there for at least IP protection, if not IP licensing.
Yeah, what Jason's saying makes a ton of sense when you're trying to become a like a standard that's universally adopted that either has to emerge from a existing killer platform that has the power to say this is the new standard and everyone wants to take advantage of our network effects, so you plug in and adopt. Or if you're not emerging from a killer platform, you really have to be an enabler of or partnered with one of the platforms, some of the platforms that get the wide distribution from the early days, right? So I think for IP standards protocol that wants to gain a network effect and be the leader makes a lot of sense. I think every project is different in terms of what their market is, what their opportunity is. Over at Livepeer, just background for the listeners, if you don't know what we are, we've been building the world's open video infrastructure. Think of Livepeer as this infrastructure developer-facing network that powers the video streaming for hundreds of video applications, ranging from social media applications to event streaming companies to internet game shows, Web 2 and Web 3, right? And we've gone through many different attempts over the last 8 years at capturing demand in different ways, targeting the Web3 community, building new cutting-edge applications on social media and NFTs, to doing traditional sales and business development, to scaled Web2 platforms, which turned out ultimately to be the way to really grow demand amongst scaled sources. Now, as we look at moving from just video transcoding and streaming to how AI is going to impact the future of video and media, there's sort of a couple interesting things happening. One is when you have this cutting edge new technology that enables innovative new things and no one knows how they're going to be used yet and what business models are going to make sense and how the economics are going to play out, they often start out looking like fun toys where you have hackers and tinkerers and innovators playing with them in their nights and weekends and spare time, and just like sharing the outputs to challenge each other, inspire each other, and because it's fun. And so rather than like a B2B motion where you're going and trying to sell to a big company, it actually creates the opportunity to say, hey, Livepeer's network that can generate videos or modify live streams of videos in real time. Right now, these are like fun toys that are being played with by hackers. And it actually creates the opportunity for a much more like bottom-up, grassroots, community-centric workflow where you have thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of hackers like experimenting with this and playing with this in real time. And then it comes later in the cycle, 6-12 months from now, when you see some of those hackers like, oh, I work at a company that's building an app and I'm going to take this in, or hey, here's a new like VC funded startup that's making a huge bet to create a new thing that couldn't have existed before based on the inspirational outputs that they just saw 6 months ago. And if you're a leading platform, a leading community, or the leading innovation in your network, that's where people will build on you. And we've seen that in the AI world with like, Hugging Face and Stability and Midjourney and whatnot as well, where they start off like, fun hacker playgrounds or toys, but then they become the platforms that the enterprises adopt. And, we've gone through that cycle in video in the past, and really looking forward to this new chapter as we apply AI video to this as well.
One of the kind of prevailing narratives at this moment in time is AI agents. Is there a role for agents to play in AI and IP?
Yeah, this is I mean, this is kind of when I say like things can go off the rails, that there's so many ways to take this. But just maybe like I think one of the interesting features, kind of relating to your first question about like what people aren't talking about enough. This is something that I've noticed in Web 2. So, I have a lot of colleagues from DeepMind who are actually, working on agents now. And talking to them, they've had very successful businesses in the agents business, like, raising $100 million and scaling to like NVIDIA and AT&T and things like that. But very strangely, like in the sort of traditional AI research world, agents are not very highly discussed. I think that's starting to change now with like these developer agents. But as a portion of like overall Web2 AI discourse, agents is probably like 20%, maybe 25 at best. Whereas in crypto, like I think agents equals AI. Like you have like 90%. Like if you think about AI, it's like this big bubble, and agents is like 90% of that bubble. So I think it's interesting, first just to note that like the prevalence of agents is much higher in crypto AI as opposed to traditional AI. And then I think there are reasons why. Number one, I think, the UX of crypto is just so poor right now that agents can actually, do a lot to simplify that. And maybe like we spent all this time trying to improve the UX. Maybe agents was the solution all along. Maybe like, all these designers maybe don't actually need to create beautiful front ends. We just have agents do things for us, right? So I think there are reasons for that. But when it comes to AI and IP and agents and IP, there's kind of two sorts of collaborations that we've seen work well at Story. The first is agents using blockchains as a ledger for licensing training data. So I think in the future, there will be sort of like a ecosystem of agents transacting with each other. And one of the primary assets being transacted is basically IP, and in particular training data. So we have, like, for example, Cerebro is actually leveraging Story to license different art assets that it can then fine tune itself upon. And so it's almost using Story like a university, like an Oxford or Harvard, to kind of learn as much as it can and autonomously license using our API those assets and improve itself. And if it generates outputs with those styles, it can actually share revenue autonomously on blockchain, right? So it's kind of like a software native payment rails as well. On the other side, I think that in general, like, my thesis is that AGI is not going to be like a single agent that's just really, really smart. It's going to be a market of agents in the same way that like the current stock market and financial market is much smarter than like any individual human. And so at the basis of that, I think, is agents being able to exchange IP with each other, right? And that goes beyond just training data. Because if you think about agents from a first principles perspective, it's basically like a black box model. And on the input side, you have essentially IP, which is training data. On the output side, you also have IP, right? Because agents right now, they're not building houses, they're not producing physical goods. So they're basically producing intellectual assets, whether that's creative, scientific, or anything else. I think if agents will actually run businesses and have sort of balance sheets in the future, a core part of their revenue stream is going to be selling IP. And maybe they'll sell IP to other agents as well, rather than having to kind of just sell directly to humans. I think as time goes on, like a human may make a request that is routed to their personal agent, and that agent might coordinate with many other agents in order to get something done. So this sort of agent to agent communication is going to be a big part of what's needed. And I think IP is going to be what they transact. And I think you're starting to see that with like the DEEF AI narrative, right? Like that is really about, hey, like instead of going to 5 different protocols, can one agent kind of coordinate across all those different protocols for me? And so maybe agents are the new APIs. So this is something that we're experimenting with at Story, where all of our documentation, we've actually just made it available so you can download and train an agent on it. And in the future, we actually plan on, as an alternative to having like individual explicit APIs, like if you want to build on Story, you actually just have a single agent that is the API. So you want to register an IP, you tell the agent and it does it for you. So you don't need like, 5 different functions. You just have an agent that is the interface to your app. And so I think that's also an interesting direction where you can have this agent-to-agent economy. So yeah, I think there's a lot of different ways you can intersect with blockchains, but those are some of the things that we've been seeing at Story.
Awesome. Do you have a view on that, Doug?
I don't think I have any mind-blowing deep expertise on this, the area of the deep overlap in IP necessarily. I would say that we're entering like brave new territory when it comes to what IP and content rights and ownership means when you are deploying and or unleashing an agent and they are, creating and issuing creative works. And I think what's probably most important, rather than starting with, firm policy or applying, traditional thoughts about what IP means, I think most important is probably like solid records of attribution or metadata associated to actions and content that are being taken by agents, so that there's just like a source of truth and like a chain of trust on what this asset was, where it was created, who deployed that thing, potentially what the inputs were. I think we still have some unpacking to do. Once that chain of truth is visible, well, what's the best way to apply it or interpret it to certain IP issues? Blockchains can be very good at establishing that chain of truth in visible and verifiable way.
Doug, maybe to add just one quick follow-up question. I mean, as it relates to Livepeer AI, and also feel free to give a little background on that specific network, as you're building it, do you currently anticipate demand to be more driven by individual humans, or are agents kind of part of the mix that you're already architecting for Livepeer AI in terms of future demand?
Yeah, it's interesting. Our community is running hard at both right now. A little background on Livepeer AI. I mentioned for years we've had this infrastructure network that was largely streaming video, and the GPUs in our network were transcoding video. Initially said, okay, all of these GPUs could be put to use for performing AI inference right now, whether that's running LLM model inference or generating images from prompts or generating videos from prompts. Right. And we went through this, period of introducing those capabilities on our network, and our node operators can offer those services, be paid using the same Livepeer network payments mechanisms for performing AI inference jobs. Right. Now, when we sort of looked at how that was being used, the early starts building on it, we saw it is a cost-effective network and it works, but like the Livepeer really offers special sauce when it comes to generating images from prompts relative to any of the other AI inference providers out there right now, of which there are many. It's very competitive. They've raised billions of dollars, and they're all offering subsidies to startups to build on them, use it for nearly free, right? And it's very competitive, and Livepeer doesn't offer a hugely distinct advantage necessarily. Where does Livepeer offer a huge advantage? It really ties back to our mission of being a video infrastructure, and particularly having this software suite that combines with our infrastructure that's tuned to handle end-to-end worldwide video streaming with low latency across all protocols, device types, and the whole technology stack that relates to video, from players to storage to ingest to transcoding to delivery to midcrest and everything. And so we've really, at Livepeer, we've really leaned in and made a bet on how is AI going to impact the future of video, and particularly live video, which is sort of one or two steps ahead of, we've seen text and then images and then short static animated GIF type things, and soon video, and then live videos coming soon. So just to give everyone an example of what this means to lean into real-time AI video, we're doing things like creating workflows where you can live stream, just like we're live streaming as we're recording this right now. And you can actually use prompts to adjust and modify the output of the stream. So for example, I could be typing a prompt right now that says Incredible Hulk, and it turns me into the Incredible Hulk as I'm moving, sort of like you might see in something, static, like in FaceTime when you add a character, except using prompts in real time, you can change that output. And so you could change it from Incredible Hulk to, Jesus wearing a golden crown, and then you morph from the Hulk into Jesus. And then you can actually make these things interactive, where if you touch a certain square or circle in the video, you apply some effect. And this is all highly dynamic, and it's run through comfy UI pipelines and workflows that are developed to tap into all the image editing AI innovation that have happened, but being applied to live video, where you actually have this whole other suite of problems, like how do you ingest it globally? What protocols do you accept? How do you stream it into GPUs to be processed in real time instead of doing it in batch? How do you play it back and serve it with low latency over different protocols? And all that expertise is what our node operator community has been doing for 8 years, and where Livepeer has a very distinct advantage or difference than every other generic, hey, we have GPUs, run what you want provider out there. So I think this focused, specialized, technology set where you can build an advantage and network effect and become a leader is really important.
I have a hypothetical that kind of ties in both with Livepeer and stories. So if we think a bit about the decentralized Netflix of the future, call it, stories, video stories, narratives on demand, but also, with a lot of the content maybe generated by AI versus how it's produced today. How do you guys think about that future? Is this even feasible? Do you see this at the end state as the end state of video entertainment? And also how, from a consumer perspective, keep up with the pace of, I guess the volume of content that's generated, and ultimately assuming individual humans are still consumers of media in the future, there are certainly, I think, additional challenges that are associated with democratizing the means of creation of this video content, even if it is fully attributable. So answering, any of those embedded compound questions, just with your vision of how this all plays out, and certainly how your individual protocols have a role to play, would be great.
I'll give a quick response to that first and hand it off to Jason. But I think if your starting point is just like the decentralized copy of the thing we have today, I don't think your mind is open enough yet, right? So like Netflix, but all AI generated. Hey, maybe. What do I know? But I think when you look at AI generated content, you'll actually think of it almost as like a different media format or content type, the same way like a TikTok, clip is different than a long form Hollywood video production. And therefore it's consumed in a different way on a different media with an entirely different usage pattern and share pattern and everything. And I think when you think of this abundance of infinite content that can be AI generated, it probably looks a lot different than the Netflix where you're browsing a bunch of premium high-end Hollywood created assets. And it's much more about personalization to you and the endless feed and the abundance of choice, and maybe keeping you entertained in a different media format. So at the end of the day, quickly, I think, a network like Livepeer is very well suited to be an infrastructure to power and enable that thing, right? For both the generation of the media and then the whole software stack and network that helps with the serving, the delivery of the player, the analytics, all that stuff. We're built to enable these forward-thinking use cases. But I think we need like the product visionaries to come in and not just try and recreate the old thing, but decentralized, and instead, think about how these media formats really change and enable new things.
Yeah, I mean, I think Doug is the kind of the world expert on this, and I fully agree with your point, Doug. Basically, I mean, things are going to get very weird. Like one of the best evidence of this that I've heard is basically, actually comparing crypto with the sort of printing press. And the idea is like, the printing press was invented, and it took 70 years or so for the Protestant Revolution to happen, right? Like it took 70 years of printing Bibles and putting them into people's hands and increasing literacy for you to have like the Catholic Church essentially disrupted and the Protestant Revolution completely shaped not just religion, but also politics. And I think peer-to-peer information, peer-to-peer social, peer-to-peer IP, peer-to-peer content is in its early innings. It's in the first few decades. So things will get really weird. When it comes to this idea of like, in a future state, like what would the Netflix of 10 years from now look like? Kind of my thesis is that the most extreme version of this is that there actually is no common content. And by that, I mean, you can imagine after a long day of work, you log on to like future Netflix and it's like, hey, Jason, you had 8 hours of meetings today. You had a podcast and you're looking for like this type of thing, right? And in the past, your friends, like it's going to query your social graph, and your friends really enjoyed this type of content recently. And you guys have been talking about X, Y, or Z. So here's like a 30-minute sci-fi thing for you with like just the right level of comedy and tragedy and what have you. And so in that world, like everyone, maybe there's some similarities, but everyone's kind of consuming a different piece of content based on what is going to be most engaging for them. And in that world, you don't have like a shared set of IP, but where the demand comes from, to tie it back to the demand conversation, all the demand for IP in that world is going to be on the training data side, right? Like people aren't paying for IP that they're going to license to someone else. They're actually there is no licensing. There's literally just your personalized IP that's like on demand generated for you in that moment. It's one of one, it's singular. And if that's the case, then I think, what blockchains will do is they will be the marketplace for training data. In a world where that's not the case, where there's a kind of opposite world where instead of everyone having singular one-of-one content, there being no shared repository of IP, I think there's another world where it's like remix mania, right? And maybe they coexist. Maybe there's like a high-end, like singular one-of-one content platform. Maybe there's like a remix mania platform. By remix mania, I mean just like imagine TikTok or YouTube Shorts or Instagram Reels on steroids, right? You already have like duets, like the most engaging platforms all engage with remixing and kind of forking each other's content. Imagine if you have like a repository globally across all apps of like characters, voices, songs, dances, styles, etc. And you can use AI to like mash them together, right? So you can say, I'm going to create like some video of myself, but with like this celebrity's face and this artist's music in the background in the style of XYZ artist. And then you can put that out to the world. And if you generate revenue, then you're going to want that revenue to be shared with like all the people whose IP Legos you basically used in creating that content. And in that world, I think again, blockchains will have a big role to play. And what Story's thesis is in that world is like Story will be like the world's IP Lego marketplace, right? And so all these platforms can, with a single API call, connect to this massive library of IP assets that they can use with monetization built in. So I think in either case, like what Livepeer and Story are doing are going to be relevant because blockchains will provide like this sort of open market for IP, no matter what the end product looks like. It's just a matter of like, is all the content in the world actually just trading data? And that's the only reason why people will pay for like specific pieces of content, or is it going to be the other direction where like every single piece of IP is going to be even more valuable as like a commodity because then people can build on top of it, right? So I don't really know. I'm not like ultimately like a consumer product guy, but I think both those roles are viable and maybe they'll coexist. Maybe you pay $100 a month to get your one-on-one movie every night. Maybe you have like this free advertising driven, mainly advertising and micropayments driven like social media thing that's like remix heavy. So I don't really know, but I think blockchains can kind of be the back end for both.
I think in this one-of-one world where every piece of content is unique, it is interesting to think about the cost involved in like generating all that content where everyone is consuming unique content that's never reusable, right? Like your $100 a month is not so much for like licensing the premium Hollywood produced thing on mass where everything gets spread amongst the creators, but it's literally just like covering the compute power to create your one-on-one unique
That's right.
content.
That's right. And that's like what Livepeer, and I think, like Livepeer, you guys are probably doing that already. So yeah, it's interesting. I mean, we're already starting to move to that world, right? Like I just started paying $200 a month to try out the OpenAI O1 Pro thing. And it's like, it's pretty insane. So I think, we could move into a world where that's the case. Unfortunately, like, right now, OpenAI is not really like a company I'm proud of supporting because right now they're not paying for the IP. And I think that's kind of a local minimum in many ways. I don't think that's a sustainable point because at the end of the day, the law will catch up and technology will catch up. And ultimately we need incentives for IP to be created because the reason why, OpenAI is so focused on like this chain of thought thing where it's like doing a lot of reasoning is because they ran out of data. They ran out of IP because, there's really not much IP left if they continue to kind of steal it. And so I think finding ways to allow companies like OpenAI to compensate for differentiated IP is going to be a much more sustainable way forward.
Can I kind of like maybe take the other side and challenge you guys a little bit on this IP idea? So there was actually a legal result not too long ago where I wish I had the details in front of me, but the gist of it was that the court sort of found that, it was legitimate to allow a model to be trained on data that was, essentially public. Like if we can, walk around and read public data or look at public images and, et cetera, like why shouldn't a machine be able to do that? Why shouldn't an AI process be able to do that? And, obviously this is a gray area. This is going to get kind of figured out in terms of, legal questions and sort of social, the social layer. But let me just kind of challenge us to say like, well, what if, if we really want to truly build very intelligent models, we just kind of have to, we have to give the models the data that is sort of visible to the world, right? Like, do you guys see that as a potential outcome here? Or do you think like maybe the whole IP thing, becomes a little bit passé at some point, right? Like in the interest of building ever bigger, ever more intelligent models or something like that. Like how would you process such an argument, or how would you like respond to that?
Yeah, it's interesting. I was actually on a podcast with some national security folks, and they're kind of, they're pro-American AI innovation. And so their whole argument was, okay, well, isn't like the idea of copyright kind of antithetical to AI development, right? Because if we're in a race with other countries to develop the best AI models and Hollywood or other creators or scientific institutions are preventing American model companies from training on this data, is that sort of slowing things down in some ways, right? So I think there's this sort of argument of like, that's been framed of like IP versus AI progress. And I think that is I think that's easy to see why someone would think that, but I actually kind of push back on that for several reasons. Number one, I do think at the end of the day, like if you take this sort of argument to its logical conclusions, I think it doesn't end up in a very sustainable place. So I think there's a sort of arbitrage that's happening today locally, where if you are Anthropic or OpenAI, you can train on the entire internet and not pay for it and get away with it because the immune system, so to speak, hasn't really been developed, right? So people aren't really ready. They just kind of scraped it without any permission, and now it's in these models, and that cat's kind of already out of the bag. But let's just say that happens for the next decade. Like, let's run that simulation through and see what happens. So if I just taking a single example, like if you're a travel blogger, you're creating a travel blog in the sort of Web 2 covenant. If your travel blog gets a certain amount of views, you can probably run ads on it and Google will pay you a certain amount of money, right? So like there's some sort of, it maybe not be the best social contract, like it definitely killed local news, but like it kind of works and it generates a lot of revenue for people who can get enough eyeballs. Now, fast forward, now you have like Perplexity, right? So instead of when someone's going to, Paris, instead of reading your travel blog, giving you an eyeball and maybe like 10 cents, they're now just going on Perplexity and Perplexity summarizing your travel blog. And it's going to be like this one bullet in the Perplexity outcome, right? And so no one's going to go to your blog. No one's going to pay you for that. And so what are you going to do? Well, after a couple of years of this, you're just going to quit, right? So let's play this out. This isn't just one travel blogger. This is everyone on Reddit. This is everyone on Yelp. This is all the journalists in the New York Times. This is literally every single person creating user-generated content is going to have the same epiphany of why the hell am I doing this, right? And so that's why I say this is like local arbitrage, because at some point the entire open web is going to die and these AI companies are not going to have live sources of data anymore. And so I think that yes, like maybe locally, it is kind of like advantageous for these model companies. Well, certainly is for them to take the IP. But in order to sustain the continued generation of IP, which is an input into these models, you need to have some basic incentive model, right? And I don't think the right solution is to kind of create like overbearing laws that prevent innovation. I think the right solution is to create a market clearing price for that IP in the open market. And the best example I can give of this is like in the early internet. So you had Napster come about, and all of a sudden, all these record labels are freaking out because now you can listen to music for free. That seems to be kind of good for consumers, but bad for musicians. And the way that the Napster issue was addressed was not by preventing piracy, right? So today, if you want to watch sports, you can still go stream that, right, illegally. You can still use like essentially BitTorrent to essentially do what Napster did, right? So, the solution is not to like prevent piracy. That's pretty much impossible. But the solution was to create a better deal for both musicians and for their listeners, which is essentially what Spotify did and also what Netflix did, right? So I think that's what Story aims to do, is to put a technology on the table that can create a market for IP as well as for the model companies in a way that's sustainable for both. Because I just don't think you can continue building large models when you don't have any incentives to sort of replenish the open commons that the data is being pulled from.
I have so much to say to that. I don't know if I should like open the can of worms in the last like 12 minutes here. But maybe let me just voice.
I told you
like,
we're
a
going to go
couple
off the
things.
rails, so
You did warn me, Jason.
there's too many paths to
man.
judge here. But yeah.
Oh my goodness. Well, let me just say like one thing. So it's not clear to me. So in your argument, it's actually like not clear to me that we landed in a optimal place with, sort of digital media IP from Web 2, right? So what I mean by that is, when I go on Amazon and Amazon wants to charge me like $14.99 to rent a new film, which costs them like literally like zero marginal cost to serve to me, I kind of feel like that's not actually like the correct market equilibrium. I feel like that movie should be like much less expensive. And the reason that it's not is because of this type of like monopolization power of Amazon that's also then being upheld by these like IP structures. So, if we let like kind of the free market, if we had let the free market like really play out here, let me take a totally different analogy. There used to be horse and buggy drivers, right? But and then they had a business model too. They would like, you would pay them money and they would like take you to like Central Park or something from Brooklyn, right? But that technology is like clearly outdated, because now the the prescient technology is driverless electric vehicles do that for you arguably at a much lower cost or somewhat lower cost. So, is it sort of correct to say like, oh man, these like horse and buggy operators are losing their jobs because of technology? Like, let's pass a law that everyone should take a horse and buggy to Central Park, right? Versus like understanding that, okay, there's a certain like technological arc there that actually creates a better, market equilibrium. I don't know, that I'm just sort of sketching, some counter arguments here, but there's so much we
Jake,
can
to
talk about.
summarize, are you saying potentially the legacy construct of IP protection is actually a baked-in subsidy for content creators in a world where perhaps the model is actually just moving away from
well,
them?
if we frame this back into how Jason's sort of steel man regarding, let's say, like international AI competition, right? So like, let's say that we pass laws that say, we have to attribute and compensate every content creator, even if that content that we're using to train is just like public information, right? While, China doesn't do that, or Russia doesn't do that, or whoever's our adversary, Al Qaeda, like, doesn't do that. You know, is that really the right strategy overall? Like, does that get us to the best like market equilibrium like for us?
Yeah, I think it's a good point, right? So the way that I frame it is there's sort of the sort of extreme thought experiment I would have is, let's say I do think, to your point, IP is kind of dead, right? Like, there's one thing that I would say in stories, like IP is dead, AI killed IP. Like, internet made IP really sick if IP were a person, and AI really killed it. And I think we're going to need to revive a new form of IP. Now, what does that new form of IP look like in the sort of digital age? I think the baseline, like lowest value case for IP, I still think there is value. So let me articulate like the lowest value case. I think the lowest value case is only AI companies are even theoretically willing to pay for IP. But let's say you have OpenAI and Anthropic, and they're the only two AI companies in the world, and they want to compete against each other. Like, okay, we talked about kind of at the beginning, there's three fronts of the war. There's the model, there's the compute, and then there's the IP, right? Like models, you can compute a little bit, but they're fundamentally not that differentiated, especially with open source. You can do a lot of damage in terms of moats for models. Compute is not really much of a moat because at the end of the day, like, you know, whether you're getting your compute from Azure or AWS, I mean, it is compute, right? So you have to pay for it, of course, but it's not differentiated. So I think like in this world of no IP protections whatsoever, there still will be demand for IP because even if IP isn't protected, these model companies need to differentiate. And so if Anthropic and OpenAI are going after an audience that is, let's say, creators, like how do you make your model better for creators? You're going to need to be able to get content that can make your model better for creators. That's going to be one of the key inputs and the key differentiators. So there is this sort of baseline level of need for IP in the form of training data. And you're going to want to have exclusive access, or at the very least, non-exclusive access to training data. And so I think one sort of feature for IP is that the primary consumer is AI, but because AI is so dependent on the quality of data, and AI research, when I was doing research, the kind of common saying is garbage in, garbage out. If you put in good, crappy, like let's say you have a crap data set, you have the best model, you train it for 10 years, it's going to give you the best crap ever. It's going to be very good at simulating crap, right? And so ultimately IP, even without any protections at all, is going to have that value of it's going to be competitive input into an AI training. I think there are other considerations. So you can add on like, stronger argument on top of that baseline, because I think defensive technologies are going to get better too. Already you're starting to see companies like Cloudflare, right? These sort of like CDNs, they're actually very, very good at preventing scrapers. So it's harder and harder to scrape the internet. It's harder and harder to get this data. So you're going to start to see this immune system come out where both, Cloudflare as well as individual creators get better at protecting their content. And another example is this research that's come out of U Chicago called data poisoning. So what data poisoning is it's kind of a hilarious defense tactic, but basically to the human eye, an image that has been poisoned looks the exact same. So for humans on a website, you don't know whether it's been poisoned or not, but to AI, it maps to like this completely, unintelligible thing. So you might like see a picture of a horse, but to an AI, it'll purposely map that horse to a blueberry. And so when someone goes to that AI model and asks, hey, draw me a horse, it'll draw a blueberry because it just thinks horses are blueberries, right? So there are going to be like a host of defensive tactics that will increase the value of IP from this baseline. And I think, the truth about the market is that it never pays what something is worth. There's no such thing as what something is intrinsically worth. It pays what it must pay, right? And so there's a baseline level of like the market must pay for IP because it's training data. And then as you have these defensive technologies, as well as I would say stories and offensive technology that makes it really low friction to get good IP, you're going to be able to increase the price because, there's going to be more protection for that IP and therefore more scarcity. So I do think we're moving into a world where like IP is very different, and the traditional like copyright, like let's prevent this from getting shared on the internet, like let's play cease and desist whack-a-mole, like that doesn't work anymore. Story's not designed for that world. It's designed for a world where there's an open market for IP. And I think there's reasons both baseline and on top of that to consider that that'll actually be quite valuable still.
I like that. And I think what makes me also feel a little bit better about the kind of existential nature of this conversation is that, well, we know that there's a lot more proprietary data out there than there is public data, right? So we can even argue that like, probably like the most sort of leaps in intelligence that we'll make, or kind of the most intelligent models in particular domains, will come from training on proprietary data that is already like protected in certain ways by the nature of being proprietary. But I don't know if anyone else had like thoughts on this.
I agree with the proprietary data comment, where I still think there's all sorts of opportunities to find the efficient markets for monetizing the proprietary data sets that otherwise are not just publicly scrapable and available. But one area I was thinking about are like for content creators, what are going to be the crazy side effects that we see when the way the content is monetized is as an input into AI model training? Just like, creators are not setting out with the intention of just like creating content that's monetized initially. They're creating it because they're sharing their craft. They want to entertain, they're motivated, they're happy, they get enjoyment, they have an audience, etc. But with the way that like social media and YouTube ends up allowing for monetization, you see these side effects in the ways that they have to create their content, right? So they have to, pause every moment and say like, give us a like or subscribe, subscribe or let us know what you think in the comments. And it affects the content because of the way that it gets monetized. And so how is the content creation itself going to be affected when the way that they have to sustain their livelihood is by making sure it's applicable for AI training? And it's just like a little bit of a, yeah, I don't know, a weird
Yeah.
glimpse into the future, if you will.
Yes. Amazing, guys. Well, thank you so much. We're definitely like on the cusp of some amazing technological innovation in the area of AI and IP and video. Thank you so much for joining us, Doug and Jason. We really enjoyed having you on the show. That was Livepeer founder and CEO Doug Petkanics and Story co-founder Jason Zhao. For those of you who tuned in, thank you so much for listening. Let's keep the conversation going. Leave us a review. Let us know what you thought. If you'd like to follow me, Jake, on Twitter, my handle is @JBrook, JBRUKH, and Evans is @Evan the Feng, spelled EVANTHEFENG. Make sure you download Mind with CoinFund where you get your podcasts, and we'll be back soon to dig deep on ideas of the blockchain space. Thank you.